Welcome everyone to a conversation today with Professor Bruno Verdini. Bruno is a professor here at MIT of negotiations. He's also got experience in the Mexican government in the Ministry of Energy, is an expert in water resources, natural rights, and the art of negotiating. He's a real Renaissance man. He's a man of sciences, a man of letters, and you're going to hear a whole lot from him right now. So then tell me this, because I am an undergraduate still. I could theoretically have been one of your students if I was a little bit smarter 4 years ago. But you're teaching this sort of groundbreaking course to undergraduates on the art of negotiating.
Yes.
What does that look like? What made you decide to do it? What made you decide to teach it at the undergraduate level?
The course I teach, which is called The Art and Science of Negotiation, I created the syllabus from scratch last spring, soon after finishing my Ph.D. here at MIT. And my goal was to be able to meet the demand of STEM undergraduates here at MIT who are passionate about practical skills. And one of the themes they always talk about from their internships is, I wish I could lead teams better and I wish I could negotiate more effectively. Where can I learn those skills? And I've been fortunate through my doctoral studies here at MIT to focus on negotiation. And for many years, for many decades, Massachusetts has been a place where in the partnerships between MIT, Tufts, and Harvard, great professors have developed several theories and frameworks to understand empirically what works in practice in negotiation. And it's with that wealth of knowledge that was part of my doctoral training that when I was entrusted with teaching the course, I said, this is what we should expose the students to, and we should add an emotional and spiritual aspect to the training we do.
And you mentioned this sort of Tufts, Harvard, MIT, the partnerships and the knowledge and skill sets that have grown out of it, especially as it relates to negotiations. But how pedagogical would you say your class is? Do you stay strictly right within the lines, or do you teach it a little bit more progressively, would you say?
I'd say it'd be great to ask my colleagues who founded the field some 30, 40 years ago, what were some of their pedagogical objectives. I think that they are intertwined with how I see the field. I've learned from them so much. I felt that the responsibility with my students, since I graduated recently in 2015, was to make sure that I would get to know them personally, and they would get to know me personally, and that we would be able to grow as negotiators by creating this safe space where we can see our own blind spots, we can discover some of our weaknesses, and realize that with practice they can become strengths. And so I felt that in some negotiation trainings, the classrooms are so large and the exercises are not practical enough that students learn negotiation at arm's length. They don't get to develop a sense of rapport with the field itself, to feel comfortable in the discussion about it. And as a result, they don't grow. They remain hard bargainers, which is something we often see in the media. And so the way we structure the course is on Mondays, you negotiate a set of confidential instructions, different scenarios. You get to experience with your colleagues how that negotiation goes. And then on Wednesdays, we debrief what happened. And then by Fridays, you write a journal, very personal, and I provide feedback on it along with my teaching team. And then as we move forward in the semester, we are creating groups based on your personality traits, on your style, on your fears, on your worries. And so in this safe space, you get to practice and develop new skills. Then I have one-on-one meetings quite frequently with them, and we get to explore. I get to often share with them this idea, which is they might come and say, I don't tend to be very assertive. I've always been this way. And I tell them, I try to give them this image, which is, what if your skills, what if your soul has all this talent, and you frame your soul as an apple, and it's frozen. And in your young, experienced, they tend to be 20, 21, the sun has been shining its light on a particular side, and these are the talents that you think define you. Well, this is a safe space where we can turn the apple, get it to melt with the light shining on a different aspect, and you'll discover that that's a strength of yours too. And so it's fantastic to see students who were very quiet and worried in the original negotiations at the beginning of the term become confident and assertive because they discovered that negotiation is not the realm of the people that stump the table and say bombastic arguments, but rather people who can build relationships, who can earn trust, who have a reputation of fairness, and that's why it's a field I really love.
Well, just for talking to you, it's a field that I love too now. I wish I could go back in my undergraduate career and take something like that,
That's so
because
kind
it
of
does
you,
sound
Zach.
like an incredible experience, a student-focused experience, and
It is.
like a caring experience
It
from
is.
a professor level.
It is.
You mentioned the hard bargain, the art of the deal, hard bargain, get you kind of negotiation tactics that we've heard so much about, especially in the past American presidential campaign season,
Sure.
in the media all the time. Do you think that there's any truth to that? You need to come to the table and be a hard, tough bargainer, or can you really be someone who's a peace builder, a relationship builder, and have success?
I think that it's quite clear that on average, a mutual gains approach to negotiation is the bedrock of agreements that are much more sustainable and flexible. There is no doubt that in certain circumstances, it would seem that a hard bargaining approach is effective. But empirical research across the world with practitioners at the highest levels, we're talking presidents, secretaries of state, CEOs, underscores that in the long run, successful agreements result from negotiations where all the relevant stakeholders can share effectively their core interests and figure out which are the traits that create value. And so the hard bargaining approach tends to limit the value that you can create because the dynamics associated with it, the aggressive tactics, tend to curtail that sense of partnership and trust that would allow you to create those traits. And as a result, even if you reach a deal that seems to be good for yourself, it often leads to the other side feeling resentful. And then they might undermine that agreement in another field, in another negotiation, or in practice, taking you to court, internationally, just not following whatever agreement you said you were part of. And so, on the contrary, when you really work to give the other side a victory speech that they can take to their back table and that is genuine, that stands on its own merit, it's much easier then to build on that and render our communities stronger. And so Winning Together, which is the name of my book coming up this November by MIT Press, underscores how in natural resource management, the US and Mexico have partnered very effectively in the Colorado River and the Gulf of Mexico to create mutual gains, to resolve core concerns that both communities have by trading across our differences and finding solutions. And so hard bargaining is of limited use in most cases. That'd be what I've seen in practice, both at the lab and in the real world.
It's funny you mentioned the Colorado River. The Colorado River is such an enormous issue for Coloradans, for people in the Midwest, all the way to the West Coast of the United States, and
Absolutely.
Mexico. I didn't tell you this before we went on screen, but I also live out in Colorado, so this is an issue that I definitely resonate with.
Wonderful.
I'm curious what you found were some of the key components to the success the Mexican and American governments have had in building this successful partnership.
In the management of the Colorado River, Mexico and the US have had to collaborate with one another for over a century. But the process and the structure of that collaboration has been, for most of the time, at arm's length. My research really unpacks the last significant negotiation that happened between mid-2000s all the way to 2012, where the two countries reestablished how they manage water in the Colorado River as it pertains to storage and environmental restoration and other elements associated with hydroelectricity. And what is significant of the study of those negotiations, and I was fortunate to interview the practitioners, talking presidents, secretaries, ambassadors, CEOs of different companies, metropolitan water agencies, is that the complexity of the challenges in the Colorado is better addressed when the two countries have a shared sense of understanding and they work hand in hand against the problem instead of against each other. Let me give you a couple of examples.
Yes, please.
Even though the US and Mexico share the Colorado River, for decades, all the way to the end of 2010, the two countries used very different modeling systems to gauge water management in the basin. What does that mean? That the US would use a modeling system that explains the impacts of storage in different dams, and Mexico used a modeling system that couldn't account for those elements. As you know, maybe the annual river flows of the Colorado are quadruple by the number of dams and storage facilities that the US has on its own side. And so really policy on the Colorado River depends on those storage facilities. Mexico was not able, when it was negotiating with the US, to really understand some of the policy proposals because they didn't even share the same mindset.
They didn't have the right data.
Exactly. And the US was proactive in collaborating with Mexico to train its officials in the model that the US relied upon in order to actually have conversations that could move forward. That's something that you would expect them to do 30, 40 decades ago, but there wasn't that degree of trust between the two countries to work in that direction. Once the two countries were able to do that, many great decisions came about from being able to see which trades were relevant. For example, in those negotiations, they discovered by doing tours, traveling to the Mexican side and then from Mexico traveling to the US side, looking at the facilities, that some significant infrastructure repairs in the Mexican canals would yield significant water savings, and that Mexico didn't have the resources to pay for those reparations, but that the US, the metropolitan water agencies in California, Nevada, and Arizona would be happy to do so because the saved water would be cheaper if sold back to the US than if they had to go and buy new water rights from agricultural producers in the US.
And those are states, those are metropolitan areas that are in desperate need of water too.
Yes, yes. And so by finding these trades across differences, by investing in the Mexican infrastructure, they were generating more water for US consumers.
So mutual gains.
Mutual gains, absolutely.
It seems to me that one of the biggest stumbling blocks a lot of great projects, great proposals run into is that they lose steam halfway through the negotiation process. They just run out of momentum. How do you avoid that problem? How do you keep the juice in a negotiation, both from the negotiators' side, the upper level, the actual players in the game, but also for larger profile deals, international deals where there's public support that needs to be maintained? How do you do that?
Well, it's always the answer will be context dependent.
Sure.
What I can share that our studies suggest in the field is that it always helps to have a very clear mandate from the highest authority possible. In the case of the Gulf of Mexico and Colorado River negotiation, it was very clear, first from President George W. Bush and then from President Obama, and the same applies to President Calderon on the Mexican side. It was very clear that they had clearly conveyed to their ambassadors that they were looking for a mutual gains solution, literally describing it that way. And once you have that clarity, and that consensus came about originally from side talks between the Secretary of Interior, Dirk Kempthorne, and the ambassador in the US on the Mexican side, Ambassador Sarukan, and they would meet frequently in Washington and talk about how can we be partners in success rather than accomplices in failure. What do we need to change in terms of our narrative in the media about how we talk about one another, and then how does that translate to our institutions? Certainly the border relationship between Mexico and the US is very institutionalized. There are a whole set of institutions, banks associated with those dynamics. And how can you give them a clear mandate that says, when you face a bump in the road, keep inside what was our main message? That clarity politically is quite significant. And then you're telling your representatives the mandate is to find ways to win together. You have to go against this mindset that if I win, you lose. There are many circumstances where the only way we can win is by using your strengths, finding a solution that maybe is good for me and great for you. And then in another topic that is of great interest for me, it tends not to be that important for you, and then it can be the other way, great for me and good for you. And so that mindset then percolates in terms of the negotiation strategies you will have and the relationships you build. There are other elements to talk about too, which is in order to create that value, you need to involve stakeholders from many different themes so that you can make the trades. And then you have to link the structure, the negotiation process, the way you sequence different issues effectively so that you can protect the process from spoilers that might not be sitting at the table. So what was interesting, for example, between Mexico and the US is that they would collaborate with one another even to the point of the press releases.
Really?
Yes. And aware, for example, of how a headline in a newspaper in Las Vegas would be translated in Mexico and interpreted. Because if you're aware of how an agreement is going to be described by the media on the other side, then you become aware that you can have situations where you make it impossible for your counterpart to come back proud and happy of an agreement. If you empower them with a victory speech, it's much easier for that agreement to be sustainable. And in order for that victory speech to be effective, the narrative has to be shared. And so it's quite complicated, of course, if you go into a negotiation and you start with threats to provide the other side with a maneuvering room to find the trades that it needs with its own constituents to give you something that you really want. You're putting them to some extent in the corner
right out of the get-go.
Right out of the get-go, and it often creates much less value as a result of that.
It seems to me that this is a pretty ephemeral thing here. There's a lot that can go wrong in a negotiation, but a couple of big points that seem to have come up are involving as many beneficiaries and actors as possible is important. Bringing people into the tent, looking for mutual gains, win. Helping the other side go home with a victory speech.
Yeah.
Those are some of the big keys.
Yes.
You say yeah?
Absolutely. There are many other elements that come into play as it pertains, for example, pre-negotiation preparation. One fantastic contribution from the U.S. State Department in the negotiations with the Gulf of Mexico is that traditionally in many diplomatic negotiations, there's a lot of preparatory work from the two countries, but at some point, one or the other comes into the meeting with a draft. And then the other delegation takes the draft and goes condition by condition and then discusses what do we say yes, what do we say no, and it's such a time-intensive process, and it usually is not that productive because, again, you don't begin from a shared sense of understanding. And so in those Gulf of Mexico negotiations, the U.S. State Department proposed that before Mexico and the U.S. negotiated with one another, they go on a series of workshops together in New Orleans, in Washington, D.C., in Mexico City, and in the Gulf of Mexico. And like in school, work through the many different topics that would be important to find a shared framework for the Gulf of Mexico, to figure out if they were looking at the problem from all the possible angles, to figure out which were the different expertise that should be present at the negotiating table, which organizations, which institutions, and those conversations, those 3 months of workshops at the time, I remember when I interviewed Mexican negotiators, Mexico had some sense of urgency in reaching a deal. And when they were proposed to do the workshops, their conclusion was, maybe the US is trying to delay the negotiations on purpose, but at the time Mexican officials felt they didn't have enough maneuvering rooms, they went about it. They were worried that this was just a delay tactic. And as time went by, on the contrary, through the workshops, they developed relationships and friendships with one another that then helped through the negotiation process, which actually in the Gulf of Mexico was the actual negotiation took a much more limited amount of time than expected. And out of those workshops, some of the relationships that emerged and that are wonderful to share in the book is the two heads of the delegations would meet periodically with their teams. And they would have this mutual gains approach. But on occasion, maybe someone from the Mexican delegation who has a high-ranking political position or from the US side would come and sit at the table and have a very different narrative, maybe a much more aggressive, hard bargaining tone. And that would rub off the wrong way the other delegation. It was jarring, that is not how we're behaving with one another. When they would have breaks for lunch or for side talks, the heads of the delegation would go with each other and say, don't worry, that person is just coming here to make a speech. But our agreement in terms of how we're going to go about this partnership remains. Both countries needed to do that frequently, to shepherd, to protect the process. And that sense of camaraderie does not occur always, but it shows that our negotiators have agency. They have maneuvering room if given the mandate to seek for a mutual gains approach, and they can navigate these bumps in the road where for political reasons someone might feel that making requests aggressively is the way to go. And those are also significant examples of partnership between the two countries.
So I want to shift gears and ask you a personal question.
Sure.
Because you came up, you're a Mexican national, Mexican and French, correct?
Yes.
You went to school in Mexico City.
Yes.
You worked for the Mexican government in the Ministry of Energy.
Yes.
And now you're in the United States teaching negotiations.
Yes.
Do you think your bilateral upbringing, bilateral life experiences, for lack of a better word, have helped you in your studies and helped you in your understanding of how different groups and different peoples come together to communicate?
Let me share something very personal with you, Zach. My family, for many generations, has this unique story where my great-granddad was born in Corsica and went and married an Italian woman. And then my great-great-granddad. And then my great-granddad was born in Italy and got married in Algeria. And then my granddad was born in Algeria and got married in France. And my dad was born in France and got married in Mexico. And I was born in Mexico and I will be married with an American woman who I met here in wonderful MIT and who I love so much. And so it's part of my upbringing, certainly this view that that exchange of cultures is enriching and riveting. When I was young, I could read literature from France or Italy and Mexico and see some of the blind spots that even my own education in Mexico had, or the education in France or in Italy. And it showed to me, particularly in Mexico, where very often we admire the US in so many things, that that empowers you to be critical about so many areas where your society can be better. And so when I decided and was fortunate to come here and do my Ph.D. at MIT, I hoped this would be a place where, and it turned out to be that way, where I would be exposed to the very best of the US in terms of its tremendous thirst for knowledge and hard work and a desire to make our world better. And that would, empower me to express the very best that I may have to offer. And so the negotiation field, the reason why I'm passionate about it, the reason why I was fortunate to convince MIT to work on a PhD in the negotiation field, the first ever that MIT gives in negotiation and leadership, was that I felt that these are fields where you can every day get better. You can get better at the relationship you have with your friends, with your family, with your colleagues, because they touch upon our emotions and how we communicate and how we come across and how we build trust and a sense of rapport and relationships. And so this is a field where, and this is a place, certainly Massachusetts, it's quite a unique place. I love Massachusetts, now 7 years here. Couldn't be more in love with Boston and everything that comes with such a passionate town, from sports to knowledge.
Very passionate.
And I think that MIT is quite unique too, in terms of its commitment to hard work and a meritocratic approach to life. The idea that if we empower each other to be our very best version, then many of our problems will be solved. And that's kind of the story behind it.
So let me ask you one last question, because we've talked about, we've been real deep in the weeds about the technical details of negotiations and heard about your background a little bit. You're teaching this course for undergraduates now. You're
Yes.
teaching undergraduates how to negotiate. You're taking
Yes.
your skills and teaching the next generation. If you had to boil down the absolute essence of what you wanted your students to get out of that class in just a couple sentences, what would it be?
That negotiation is an opportunity for you to get to know yourself much better, to really embrace who you are, figure out what principles and values you stand for. And that once you're clear about it, you trust yourself, you value what you bring to this world, you can sit down with someone who might be different from you, who might have different challenges, different priorities. And you can trust that with those negotiation skills and strategies, you can work together to make a world a better place.
Professor Verdini, thank you so much for that. Your students are very lucky to have you.
I'm
MIT is lucky to have
them.
you, and I was lucky to get to talk to you today, so thank you very much.
Zach, thank you so much for your time.
That wraps our conversation with Professor Verdini. I know I learned a great deal, and I hope you at home did as well. If there's anything we can take away from that, it's that negotiations doesn't have to be a one-sided game. Together, we always win more. For APN, I'm Zach Merchant.